Today we're diving deep into a topic that bridges 16th century alchemy with 21st century technology. I'll be pointing out parallels between last episode's strange glyphs hidden in the data of Google's Willow quantum processor and my theory connecting them to two alchemists from the 16th century. But this isn't just about history or science. This episode is a warning, a mirror held up to an image of humanity's relentless pursuit for knowledge at the cost of their humanity. Have you ever wondered about the origins of aliens, ghosts, or demons? Have you ever asked your priest or pastor if the Bible can explain these things, only to come away with no real answers? Well, I don't know about you, but I have. So, I've spent 15 years researching these topics, and I've pieced together a very compelling explanation for many of the world's mysteries. I'd like to start a conversation about the things your pastor is afraid to talk about. This is Audra Moore, and you're listening to Evil's Ancient Origins. First, let me introduce John Dee, who was no ordinary man. Born in 1527, Dee was a mathematician, astronomer, and advisor to Queen Elizabeth I. But beneath the polished surface of his intellect stirred a yearning for divine secrets. He believed that true knowledge, the kind that could unify Christendom and unlock cosmic mysteries, could only be accessed through supernatural means. According to the book Angelic Language by Aaron Leicht, there is a long-standing tradition that Dee was England's first official spy, traveling across Europe on the Queen's business, but under the guise of an eccentric old wizard. He was known to use an encryption code in his communications with the Queen and would sign these letters with the moniker 007. The author of Angelic Language goes on to say that Dee was interested in angelic magic throughout his life. ChatGPT says that angelic magic is a branch of ceremonial or esoteric magic that involves communication with, invocation of, or the channeling of messages from angels. It is typically practiced with the intent of gaining spiritual insight, divine guidance, hidden knowledge, or power through beings believed to be messengers of God. While it often uses Christian symbols and language, it diverges significantly from mainstream Christian theology and is generally considered occult. The book states that after many attempts at contact, Dee's real work only began when he met Edward Kelley in the year 1582. Now, Edward Kelley was a young medium who claimed that he could speak with angels. Since Dee had already tried unsuccessfully to contact heavenly beings through scrying, Kelley was seen as an answered prayer of sorts. On their first attempt together, Kelley stated that he was able to see, hear, and speak to the angels with ease. This began years of spiritual seances, with Kelley gazing into crystal balls and scrying mirrors, while Dee meticulously recorded the visions and dictated messages. And from these visions emerged what Dee called the Enochian language, an entirely new script and grammar which was allegedly the language of angels. The book goes on to state that Kelley had an uncertain and perhaps dark history, but we can be certain that he was an avid student of alchemy and that this was likely what had brought him to Dee. But there are questions about Kelley's character. Wikipedia claims that an English antiquarian named Anthony Wood claimed to have placed Kelley as being from Oxford, a student who, nearly a decade before meeting Dee, was pilloried in Lancaster for forgery or counterfeiting. You know, he was put in stocks and made a public spectacle of. Pillory, there's a new word for our vocabulary. It also states that both of his ears were probably cropped, a common punishment during the Tudor dynasty, and that Kelley usually wore a cap on his head, which was thought to hide his lack of ears. So this raises concern about Kelley's true character, although people of true moral character would never have attempted such a task in that era anyway. So there's two ways of looking at this. Now, as a reference, this Enochian language, which they claim to have acquired during their contact with the angels, was named after a little-known character in the Bible who carries a mystery of his own. Enoch is a very obscure character who no one really knows about. If you do a search of the name in the Bible, Enoch is only mentioned 11 times in only 4 books, most of them being within 2 chapters in Genesis, and then once in Luke, once in Hebrews, and once in Jude. Now, in Genesis, the name Enoch is only listed within genealogy. In chapter 4 of Genesis, the writer lists the genealogy of Cain after he was banished from Adam and Eve's region as a punishment for murdering his brother Abel. As it so happens, Cain's own son is listed as an Enoch. Very interesting. Maybe this is the Enoch these angels were really naming the magic system after. I mean, it's Cain. Anyway, then, in the very next chapter, chapter 5 of Genesis, the author is recounting the genealogy of Adam as traced through Cain's brother, Seth, running all the way to Noah. And it just so happens that there is another Enoch. This one is the great-grandfather of Noah. What's strange is, as he is being mentioned, the author breaks protocol. Let me explain. This is one of those chapters that no one reads because each verse is structured just like the last in a mundane list of generations. You know, it goes like, so-and-so lived so many years, he had a son, his name was such and so lived so many more years, had other sons and daughters, and then he died. And on it goes, verse after verse, for what seems like a long list of people. But if you're stubborn enough to make it through to the last few, you're rewarded with Enoch's mention, where after concluding his father Jared's verse, it says, "And Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years, and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years." And this is where it breaks the pattern. Enoch walked with God and was not, for God took him. There are a few peculiar things that we could discuss about this verse, but the one I want to focus on here is the fact that he was not, because God took him. Yes, that's pretty strange. This sort of thing has only happened to a few other people in the Bible, Elijah and Jesus himself. That is, after his crucifixion and resurrection, of course. So this places Enoch in a very small club of very important people. I find it strange that he really isn't a more substantial character within Christendom. Since there's a whole magical practice supposedly named after him, it seems that within occult circles his value is recognized. So why not within Christendom? Now, let's look at those last few verses where he is mentioned. The books of Luke, Hebrews, and Jude. Notice those are all within the New Testament. So, okay, I want to ask, why is this character never mentioned again in the Old Testament? You'd think that someone who was so valuable to God that he just took him would carry a little more weight in the Old Testament scriptures, but Enoch is strangely absent. Why? Let's see what the New Testament had to say about Enoch. In Luke, Enoch is once again listed in genealogy as a descendant of Jesus, tracing all the way back to Adam. So that's a long one of the so-and-so begat so-and-sos. But in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 5 says, "By faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and he was not found, because God did translate him. For he hath had witness borne to him that before his translation he had been well-pleasing unto God." So this is attesting to Enoch's moral character. Now, in the book of Jude, we shift gears. But first, I want to fill you in on who wrote the book of Jude. The letter identifies its author as Jude, a servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James. Going a little deeper, Google Search AI states that the book of Jude was traditionally written by Jude, brother of James, and one of Jesus' 4 brothers. And that James, the brother of Jesus, was a leader in the church in Jerusalem. And for context, Google also says that the letter of Jude is a short New Testament epistle that warns against the false teachers who are corrupting the early Christian community. So, I want us to understand what Jude, the brother of Jesus, and also of James, the leader of the church of Jerusalem, is talking about when he mentions Enoch, by reading a few short verses here. Beginning in verse 12, Jude writes, "These are they who are hidden rocks in your love feasts, when they feast with you, shepherds that without fear feed themselves. Clouds without water, carried along by winds, autumn trees without fruit, twice dead, plucked up by the roots, wild waves of the sea, foaming out their own shame, wandering stars, for whom the blackness of darkness hath been reserved forever. And to these also Enoch, the 7th from Adam, prophesied, saying, Behold, the Lord came with 10,000s of his holy ones, to execute judgment upon all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their works of ungodliness, which they had ungodly wrought, and of all the hard things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. These are murmurers, complainers, walking after their lusts, and their mouth speaketh great swelling words, showing respect of persons for the sake of advantage." These verses are quite poetic in describing an ethereal presence of darkness that God will judge in the end times, connecting them to the angelic rebellion of old. Jude is talking about actual people, but his words also address the spiritual aspect of their darkness that will be eternally damned. We know this is true because at the beginning in verse 4 he says, "For certain people who long ago were designated for this condemnation, ungodly people who pervert the grace of our God into sensuality and deny our only Master and Lord, Jesus Christ." Now, I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, who saved a people out of Egypt, afterward destroyed those who did not believe. And the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. So Jude is linking an angelic connection to these abominable actions. Now, in the previous verses I mentioned, Jude directly quotes something that Enoch said, even calling it a prophecy. Yet, there's no mention throughout the Old Testament or the New that includes anything that Enoch has said. I mean, Jude was the last of the 11 mentions, and nowhere else has it said anything about what Enoch had said. There are 16 whole books in the Old Testament which are written by and named after prophets, but Enoch isn't one of them. I don't know about you, but I find it strange that someone so prominent in the early Christian church would quote a prophet and that prophet isn't included in biblical canon. I'm just saying. I mean, in my opinion, this is clear evidence that there is a remnant of Enoch's writings that have been somehow lost over the many centuries, including from the document that Christians of today call their Bible. As you can see, the brother of Jesus himself felt that Enoch had something important to say, so why shouldn't we? At what point did this document lose its value enough that it was discarded from our historical teaching? Well, it just so happens that there is an ancient document known as the Book of Enoch. By this point, all of our well-educated theologians have gotten out their pitchforks and are calling me a heretic. But for complete transparency, let's say that there are a few documents which are claimed to have been authored by Enoch. And this is probably why he isn't included with the prophets. Scholars have had trouble tracking the origin of these versions of these various books, and they have been hesitant to call any of them official. They claim that none of them are old enough to predate the New Testament. But I say that they just haven't found a copy of the document that predates the New Testament. Think about it. These letters were handwritten by scribes and passed on generation after generation, deteriorating until someone educated enough to make a new copy decided to do so, or someone paid someone to do so. But then, what about the copy found within the Dead Sea Scrolls? I mean, that's predating Jesus. And the copies found preserved in Ethiopia. Isn't it just like the enemy to use confusion to obscure the message of God? So that first segment of Jude I mentioned, if you search the whole thing in Google, asking where in the Book of Enoch the quote is from, Google will direct you to 1 Enoch, chapter 60, verse 8, where it mentions that Enoch was the seventh from Adam. So that little segment is picked up in the search. But this isn't even the most relevant part of the verse. It isn't even the quote. What's more is the verse that Google sent you to is actually written by Enoch's grandson, Noah, disqualifying it as even being a quote from Enoch. But if you take just the quote itself from the book of Jude, where it reads, "Behold, the Lord came with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their works of ungodliness which they have ungodly wrought, and of all the hard things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him." And search just for that. I mean, you find a very similar passage in 1 Enoch chapter 1, verse 9, where it states, "And behold, he cometh with 10,000s of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all, and to destroy all the ungodly, and to convict all flesh of all the works of their ungodliness, which they have ungodly committed, and all of the hard things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him." Sounds to me like a pretty close match to the content Jude was referencing. Of course, it's not word for word exactly, because just as the telephone game demonstrates, some of the words have changed since it has been translated hundreds of times over the years, but the message still holds up. So, here we have actually 2 verses referenced from the Book of Enoch, which were mentioned in the Bible by a person who was very connected to Jesus himself, a person who values what the Book of Enoch has to say. In my opinion, that lends much credence to this manuscript called the First Book of Enoch, part of which is also known as the Watchers. Now, with all that being said, let's get back to the 16th century alchemists. These 2, let's just call them warlocks, were having seances to conjure angels. They claim that during the 7 years within which Kelley and Dee were working together, they gathered information that included an alphabet, which was the foundation for a whole language with pronunciations and grammar. Then they received sigils, spells and incantations, and eventually a whole system they called Enochian magic. Dee claimed that he felt it was innocent enough because these good angels would never steer them wrong. But as we know, there are angels who present themselves as angels of light, which have been steering man wrong since the beginning of our documented history. So there did finally come a point where Dee discerned that what he was dealing with were not the benevolent angels he thought they were. But by this point, he was so engrossed in the knowledge that they were gaining, he felt that it was too late to turn back. Eventually, things became so out of control that he wouldn't have been able to turn back even if he had wanted to. The main spirit no longer appeared to him as strong and noble, but had morphed into a hollow-eyed harpy, which began to visit him without even being summoned. As time went on, his wife and children as well were experiencing the darkness that he had unleashed within his house. Let this be a good lesson for us to recognize that playing seemingly innocent games with the dark side is never a good idea. Once you invite them in, they now have dominion. You compromise your authority by accepting their offerings, and you no longer have any power. They will always turn on you in the end. As Derek Prince eventually concluded, there's no need to interact with them at all. You just cast them out. At this point, you might be asking, if they were getting this information from angels, why call it Enochian? Well, to understand that, you have to be familiar with the information contained in the Book of Enoch. Enoch is called the chronicler. As you may have noticed from my previous mention of the passage in Genesis, early humans lived for hundreds of years. I attribute this to the fruit Adam and Eve must have been eating from the tree of life before they were expelled from the Garden of Eden. I mean, God said you can eat from any of the trees, just not the tree of knowledge. So they had free reign to eat from the tree of life. I also attribute this to the fresh coating in their DNA, not to mention the lack of toxins in their environment at that time. So there's many reasons why they may have lived longer. So, Adam and Eve lived hundreds of years and saw many of their generations grow old. They chose a person who would be tasked with passing on their story to further generations once they were gone. A chronicler. I think they chose Enoch due to his deep conviction and moral standards, which had been a result of his personal relationship with God. They must have felt that he could be trusted to diligently and accurately pass on the stories of old. At some point, Enoch is approached by the fallen angels, or watchers, who ask him to speak to God on their behalf. Because of his closeness to God, they saw him as someone who could put in a good word for them. I'll explain that whole scenario in another episode, but for the sake of this episode, let's just say that Enoch's communication with the fallen angels must be the reason why Dee and Kelley named their communications after him. And in my mind, this would seem to indicate that they knew that they were dealing with fallen angels. It didn't end well for either Dee nor Kelley. There was a lot that went on. Feel free to investigate it on your own. I'm just going to say, I feel sorry for John Dee's wife. Now, I want to fast forward to our century. In my last episode of Evil's Ancient Origins, titled Willow's Quantum Ghost in the Machine, Is Google Communicating with Another Dimension? Google's Willow quantum processor began generating anomalous outputs during their recent experimentation. Some of their researchers started to notice peculiar symbols emerging from their junk data, glyphs that bore a strange resemblance of ancient alphabets, including Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Chinese oracle bone scripts, and Nordic runes. To be clear, these symbols weren't part of any known programming or machine logic. They emerged organically from the noise and chaos of the machine's unrefined output, like something or someone was speaking through the gaps in their code. Doesn't this sound familiar? Google's search for quantum supremacy is a type and a picture of the same quest Dee and Kelley were on. As I was researching that last episode, I could hardly contain my need to express the glaring similarities between these two stories. Could the angelic language Dee and Kelley conjured and the symbols and scripts that Google's researchers had discovered be one and the same? Wouldn't that be wild? Could it be that they've built a new kind of quantum scrying mirror, a digital showstone, capable of communicating with the fallen realm? The same dimensions that Dee and Kelley had tapped into. So I can't find any actual samples of what was being generated by the Willow processor. So therefore, I am unable to compare the two, but I'd love to know if the specialists they brought in, the linguists, even considered the Enochian script in their investigation. Now, Scripture has always warned us against the kind of contact Dee and Kelley sought after. Deuteronomy 18, verses 10 through 12 says, "There shall not be found among you a counselor, a consulter with familiar spirits, or a wizard or a necromancer. For all that do these things are an abomination unto the Lord." Genesis 3:6 states, "And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit." The original temptation was to grasp divine knowledge outside of God's guidance, all so that they could be like God, knowing good and evil. Ecclesiastes 1:18 says, "For in much wisdom is much grief, and he that increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow." Dee and Kelley weren't just curious scholars. They were men attempting to bypass God's will, to access forbidden knowledge, just like Adam and Eve had. They sought unity, power, and transformation, but ended in disgrace. Kelley was ultimately imprisoned and died under mysterious circumstances. Dee, isolated and broken, faded from mainstream history, remembered only by occultists. Our technology is beginning to touch the same spiritual nerves. Quantum computing works in a realm of uncertainty, of probabilistic states, of entanglements that resemble the old magical dreams of interconnected reality. When symbols that resemble angelic glyphs start to appear where they shouldn't, we must ask, are we once again peering into forbidden dimensions? We're no longer using polished obsidian mirrors and incantations. We're using AI and quantum computers. But the Tower of Babel wears many disguises. So, Dee developed a personal emblem, a single glyph meant to contain all sacred knowledge, alchemical, astrological, and divine. He believed meditating on it could open spiritual gates. But what Dee failed to understand is that seeking divine truth outside of God's authority opens gates not to heaven, but to destruction. Just as Eve was deceived by the serpent's promise of wisdom, Dee and Kelley believed they were communing with angels, and they weren't necessarily wrong. It's just that the fruits suggest they were of the fallen variety. Let me just say, we must be vigilant. The desire to know more, to explore deeper, is not inherently evil. But when knowledge becomes an idol, and we pursue forbidden things for personal gain, replacing our faith in the Most High God with our own works, it will surely lead to ruin. We must know the Word of God in order to discern the spirits. 1 John chapter 4 reads from verse 1, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit. Instead, test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets and teachers have gone out into the world. By this you know and recognize the Spirit of God. Every spirit that acknowledges and confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, and every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not of God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard is coming and is now already in the world." Today's quantum researchers and yesterday's alchemists may be closer in spirit than they realize. Both are tempted to crack the code of creation, but without the Creator. And when we do that, we find madness and deception. Guard your hearts. Stay rooted in Scripture. Stay discerning. Stay faithful. And stay close to Jesus. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you join us again next time when we start another conversation about the things your pastor is afraid to talk about. This is Audra Moore, and you're listening to Evil's Ancient Origins. Look for us next time on Spotify, YouTube, and wherever your favorite podcasts are found.